During set 10's release, we quickly realized here in Japan that there is a new potential best deck in town, and that belongs to the nation of Dragon Empire, and it is the brand new edition of Gandiva. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen the tournament results from Japan or from Asia in general that plays the Japanese format, and you've probably seen that the new ride line that was just introduced has been picking up a lot of waves. And so to prepare you for the DBT10 format in English, I wanted to go over what Gandiva actually does, as well as show you 5 different deck lists on how you can build it, because there's basically 2 main variants and then a hybrid of the 2 that kind of puts both ideas together, and these are both different in ride line as well as the overall general structure of the deck. And you can definitely customize quite a lot with the deck in order to fit your local meta and what you see most commonly as your opponent as well. Now, I also like to call this the best deck for beginners because the things that Gandiva does are very straightforward. It is a deck that is perfect for someone that wants to learn Vanguard or take their Vanguard to the next step competitively. And in Japan, the deck is very cheap. In Japan, you can build the deck for like 80 bucks, 70 bucks. Like, it is ridiculously cheap because basically the whole deck is in set 10. So you can just build it from the packs of set 10 itself with like a couple cards like triggers, as well as an order from set 3 and some commons from set 3, and that's it. However, I really hope that the English market and the, the sellers of the English market that determine the prices are also kind when it comes to Gandiva prices, and you can also have this cheap and affordable deck that can be built just from set 10. But I think that depends on how much set 10 will be open in English. If it's the same as in Japan, it's gonna sell like hotcakes and go absolutely crazy. So the stock should, generally speaking, be a bit, a little bit cheaper. So I really hope that this can also be a deck in English that can be built for around 100 bucks, because this would be a perfect thing for the game, which it is in Japan. That's something that people have been really asking for, and it finally happened. Before we get into the deck list though, please do make sure that you are subscribed. I would really appreciate it if you did, and if you're watching this without a YouTube account, then what are you waiting for? Please make one and subscribe. I'm trying to reach 100k subscribers, and your support is necessary for that. And if you want to support me in any other ways, consider becoming a YouTube channel member. There are a bunch of bonuses included, such as joining my remote fight tournaments, as well as I'm planning to ramp up some exclusive content for YouTube channel members as well, so you might want to check that out too. But anyway, let's get on with the video. So it must be one of the few times you've seen this background without chibi me, but first we're going to go over what Gandiva does and what the key cards are. So the first, of course, key card is Gandiva himself, and so this boss unit in his second skill is the reason why this deck is so strong. And it says, during your turn, for every face down card in your bind zone, your front row units get plus 2k power, and if you have 5 or more units in the bind zone, then he gets an extra critical. And reaching this 5 amount is your goal for your first grade 3 turn, and yes, you can do it relatively easily. That 5 also means your front row is getting plus 10k power as well, so you're basically like persona riding without persona riding, which is really, really strong. Now, how do you fill up that bind zone? Well, his first effect says, if during your turn you retire an opponent's rear guard, whether it's through an effect or an attack, then you can choose a card from your bind zone and bind it face down. An important thing to note with binding face down is that you, the player, can check what your face down bind is, but your opponent cannot. So if you, for example, guard with a bunch of your triggers early, you can then choose to bind them face down, and then when your opponent goes and asks like, hey, how many criticals have you seen? You can just say none, because they're all face down in the bind zone, your opponent cannot check them. And of course, just retiring and attacking rear guards is all fine and dandy, but how are you gonna actually do that if the effect isn't there? Well, the final skill of Gandiva is, of course, you can count almost once per turn and then select different grade rear guards on your opponent's side of the field. So for example, 0, 1, 2, and 3 would be the maximum, but in most cases, you're usually hitting like 2 or 3 at the most. And so you can select these different rear guards and then reveal the top 5 cards of your deck. And then from those 5 cards, you look for cards with the same grades as the ones you selected, and each one that you hit, you retire. So for example, if you select, let's say 1 and 2, and your top 5 has just a 2, then you'll retire just that grade 2, and then nothing else, and only 1 grade 2. Even your opponent has like a field full of grade 2s, then you're only retiring 1 grade 2. And the best part is that if you only retired 1 or less cards, so you can also retire 1 to proc this, you get to draw a card and choose a card from your drop and bind it face down. So retiring advances your bind zone, as well as the effects of this deck also advance your bind zone. Now you have 2 supporting rear guards that help you to retire your opponent's cards while advancing your bind zone. The first one is the grade 3 Stiruguna. So this card basically allows you to soul blast one and bind one of your other rear guards face down in order to either retire one of your opponent's rear guards, and if you couldn't, then you draw one and bind a card from your drop zone face down. And again, if you retire through this effect, then Gandiva's effect will proc to let you bind from drop zone anyway. But keep in mind that, against pesky matchups like Eva, where you can't retire their obscudates, you will just draw a bunch of cards because you're not retiring anything most of the time, but your bind zone will advance very quickly. So with this card alone, you're actually already binding 2 cards because one is part of the cost, the other one is part of the effect. Then we have the Ruguento, so he's kind of similar, but he costs a counterblast. So when he's placed, you can counterblast 1 if you have a Gandiva Vanguard, and then you can retire an opponent's rearguard, but if you couldn't retire, then you draw 1 and get to bind a card from your drop zone face down. This also means that if your opponent's field is empty, you also get to do this too. So that adds another card to the bind, so now we're already at 3 without even using the Vanguard's effect. And now you might be thinking that's already quite a bit of counterblast we're using, but there's actually a countercharger that advances your bind zone too. This one is Pausen, so he says when your Gandiva Vanguard attacks in the back row rearguard circle, so make sure he's not in your front row, otherwise you can't use him. If you have 3 or more cards in your bind zone, so you already have to have a little bit, but as we just showed 2 different examples, you can set up 3 pretty easily. You can then bind him face down to countercharge 1, so that gets you to your 4th bind card while giving you countercharge, which is really strong. And then in my opinion, the key card of the deck, which is the Alpha Car. Alpha Car says when your Gandiva Vanguard attacks, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, very important note, you can counterblast 1 and bind him face down to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and choose a unit card that is equal to or, well, I mean, equal to or lower grade than your Vanguard or grade 3 or lower, and call it to your rearguard circle. So he replaces himself basically with another attacker, and this also deck thins at the same time, so your chance of hitting triggers and finding your key pieces is actually higher. And this also procs your on-place effect, so you can proc the cards that we just mentioned earlier too. So with that, you know, just using these different cards I just showed you already built up 5 cards in bind zone, again without even using the Vanguard's effect. As you can see, this deck has power, draw power, you know, multiple attacks, countercharging. Just the core cards of the deck already allow you to do so much. Now you might be thinking, okay, if I'm retiring all of my opponent's cards, and then that means I'm not drawing because the draw effect is tied to not retiring. That's where there's an order from set 3 that comes in handy, which is Best Harvest. Best Harvest says you play it, and for that turn, your Vanguard gets the ability that every time you retire a rearguard, you draw a card. So by seeing Best Harvest and retiring cards, you get to draw cards. If you don't retire cards, you draw cards anyway, so you are going to have a big hand in this deck no matter what. And the final thing I'll talk about is of course the ride line. So the grade 1 of the ride line allows you to basically ride up for free into the grade 2 of the ride line as long as your opponent has 1 or less rear guards. But if they have 2 or more and they decide to start calling things out early, that means that he will actually call himself out with his 2nd skill from your soul when ridden over, so no matter what, the effect will proc. The free ride up is definitely nice, but a lot of people are replacing this grade 1 in their ride decks. But what people are hesitant to replace is the grade 2. The grade 2 says when Gandiva rides over him, the act skill of that Gandiva costs Counterblast 1 less. So what that means is that you use Gandiva's Counterblast 1 skill for Counterblast 0, meaning that even if your opponent like damage denies you, you will still be able to use Gandiva's effect. So that has been all of the core cards of the Gandiva deck explained, and as you can see, it's definitely quite easy to understand why this deck is so good too. So now let's take a look at 5 different sample deck lists to give you a better idea of how the deck works. This first list is one of the pure variants that I would call, and as you can see, we're basically running 4 copies of all of the archetype cards as well as running the Gandiva ride line, and you see the inclusion of the 3 cycle cards, which is a triple rare from set 10 as well, which basically says when you discard during your ride phase, you can soul blast 1 to bot deck it to draw 1, which helps you to not run out of cards when you're riding up. And the second skill is if you persona road, when you call it, you can counterblast 1 to retire an opponent's column, which is pretty strong because you get 2 binds from Gandiva from using this, so that's also pretty good. And the other card that we see is run quite often in Gandiva lists is the Brachioforce. So Brachioforce is an old common that says when its attack hits, you may retire it to draw 1 and retire one of your opponent's rearguards. This is really nice because if with Brachioforce you hit one of your opponent's rearguards while you are on Gandiva, you will get to bind 1 card from your drop zone from the attack hitting, and then you also get to bind 1 more from the retire happening from Brachioforce. On top of that, sometimes you actually don't have a very big drop zone in cases where, you know, you didn't get aggroed much, you didn't guard much in the early game, or just in general, like you haven't had to discard too much for the ride deck, for example, if you use the Gandiva ride line. This is where Brachioforce, by self-retiring itself, becomes fodder for you to bind from drop zone, which is also very nice. You'll notice that Gandiva players also run very aggressive trigger lineups with 8 critical triggers and 3 front triggers. Sometimes you'll see 4 fronts even too, because they're very strong in this deck as well. This second variant is also very similar, but we do see a bit of a difference in ratios. So we're running 3 of the counter chargers as well as 3 of the best harvest. And here you're actually seeing the Brachiosaurus being taken out entirely for 2 copies of the Meteor Flare Dragon. Now, Meteor Flare Dragon is a card that is played specifically to counter the Eva matchup, because while it is the order in Eva that prevents the Obscurates being retired, Meteor Flare Dragon, when it is cold, simply says that all of your opponent's rearguards lose their continuous effects. And then you may kind of almost want to retire something, but usually you skip that. But losing continuous effects means that the Obscurates cannot intercept and do not have their plus shield. So the grade 2 one will be just 5k shield, and the grade 3 one will basically just be a vanilla on the board. So Eva loses one of her biggest strengths, which is having those, you know, that 20k intercept every single turn. So if your locals is full of Eva, you might want to consider running Meteor Flare. And now a different kind of list has popped up for Gandiva, which is one that uses the buff Sagara ride line. So as I mentioned before, sometimes by using the Gandiva ride line and riding up for free, you simply don't have much of a drop zone in order to bind. With the buff Sagara ride line, what you're able to do is, with the Namokar's effect, you search out an arms, which deck thins your deck by 1, which means your chance of hitting triggers is higher. And then for your grade 2 ride, you will discard it to ride into the Haribadora, and then the Haribadora gets it back into your hand, and then next turn you can discard the grade 3 arms once again in order to ride again as well. So you basically get to ride up into grade 2 and grade 3 from 1 card, which is very cost efficient. And you can see that this variant of the deck runs 4 of the Meteor Flare, so this one is really against Eva and trying to get rid of her, and also running the draw triggers, which you don't see too much because it does lead to deck out. Here's another variant of the buff Sagara ride line list. As you can see, the Gandiva parts are still very consistently like 4, 4, 4, 3. The counter charger is quite common to see at 3 copies, sometimes you'll see it at 4 even, but here we see instead of the Meteor Flare, it is the Brachiosaurus, which is giving us that extra fodder for the self-bind. And finally, this is a hybrid list of the 2 ride lines, which is actually from a player called Man Long, who won with this list in the Daivangasai Cup. So you can see that here we're actually using the grade 1 of the buff Sagara ride line to search out the weapon and still deck thin, but we are only going as far as discarding it for the grade 2 ride, as the grade 2 of the Gandiva ride line allows you to reduce the cost of Gandiva, which will save you CB, especially if you get damage denied, because people are getting better and better at playing against Gandiva all the time. Here we do see some reduction of ratios though, as we see that both the Stirguna as well as the Ruguento are reduced to 3 copies. Choosing to play 4 of the counter charger, making sure that you are always being able to use your cost even if you get damage denied, and 1 copy of the Barunaya. So Barunaya allows you to basically, if either player's rearguard has been retired this turn, to self-bind it at the end of the attack that it boosted and then draw a card. So this helps you to just cycle through cards, and also another way to fill up your bind zone, but having to retire one of either player's rearguard during that turn can be a bit tricky if you haven't been able to target anything on your opponent's side, because that means you have to overcall one of your own units. And those have been the 5 lists for Gandiva, as well as a brief explanation of what the deck does. So I hope that this has helped you to prepare for Gandiva coming out in English. I actually have a fight video going up pretty soon where I demonstrate its power using a build made up of mostly set 10 cards, so that you can also basically see how the deck performs if you only build it with set 10 cards plus like best harvest and triggers and peaches basically. So no Meteor Flares, no Brachiosaurus, basically just maxing out on cards from set 10 so that even a beginner can pick up the deck immediately just from set 10 cards, and you know, just the perfect cards that you kind of need to have in this game, and get right into the heat of things with Vanguard. So I hope that this video helped you all, whether you already knew what Gandiva does or you don't. If it was helpful, please do give it a like. I would really appreciate that, and let me know in the comments what you think of Gandiva, and if there's any other kind of builds or which kind of build you prefer from the 5 that were shown. And of course, please don't forget to subscribe, because it really does help the channel, and I would really greatly appreciate it. But otherwise, that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.